Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Kristen Welker in Washington, where the administration's top intelligence chiefs faced questions about the war with Iran and their assessment about Iran's nuclear capabilities, which the president has used as a justification for launching the military strikes. All while the war shows no signs of de-escalating, and as the status of the Strait of Hormuz, that critical waterway for global shipping, remains in limbo. Today, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, CIA Director John Ratcliffe, and other top intelligence officials were on Capitol Hill for a worldwide threats hearing, and the Iran war was the top issue. In her prepared opening statement, Director Gabbard wrote, quote, "As a result of Operation Midnight Hammer last summer, Iran's nuclear enrichment program was obliterated. There has been no efforts since then to try to rebuild their enrichment capability." But notably, Director Gabbard did not read that portion of her statement during her remarks. Some Democratic senators noting that omission and pressed Director Gabbard on whether Iran posed an imminent threat, as the president claimed.
You omitted that paragraph from your oral opening. Was that because the president had said there was an imminent threat 2 weeks?
No, sir. I recognize that the time was running long, and I skipped through some of the portions.
So you chose to take
my oral delivered remarks.
You chose to omit the parts that contradict the president.
Was it the assessment of the intelligence community that there was a, quote, imminent nuclear threat posed by the Iranian regime, yes or no?
Senator, the only person who can determine what is and is not an imminent threat is the president.
False. This is the worldwide threats hearing where you present to Congress national intelligence, timely, objective, and independent of political considerations. Was it the assessment of the intelligence community that, as the White House claimed on March 1st, there was a, quote, imminent nuclear threat posed by the Iranian regime? Yes or no?
Once again, Senator, the intelligence community has provided the inputs that make up this annual threat assessment.
You won't answer the question.
It is the nature of the imminent threat that the president has to make that determination based on a collection and volume of information and intelligence that he is provided with.
It comes after yesterday the director of National Counterterrorism Center, Joe Kent, resigned over the war, saying Iran did not pose an imminent threat. Today, CIA Director John Ratcliffe was asked about that resignation. Listen.
I want to ask you, Director Ratcliffe, yesterday the head of the National Counterterrorism Center resigned, saying that Iran did not represent an imminent threat to the United States. Is there anything to indicate that Iran had ceased in its nuclear ambitions or in its desire to continue to build ballistic missiles capable of threatening American troops and allies in the Middle East?
Senator, no. In fact, the intelligence reflects the contrary.
So you disagree with Mr. Kent?
I do.
It all comes as the war continues to intensify. Yesterday, the Pentagon saying U.S. forces used multiple so-called bunker busters to hit Iranian missile sites near the coast of the Strait of Hormuz. Israel also touting its own military operations, saying today it killed Iran's intelligence minister. Iran's president confirmed his killing and called his death and those of other top Iranian officials, quote, cowardly assassinations. This morning, in retaliation, Iran fired cluster munitions, which you can see right here, detonating in midair over Tel Aviv. Joining me now is NBC News senior national security correspondent Courtney Kube, NBC News White House correspondent, senior White House correspondent Garrett Haake, and NBC News international correspondent Matt Bradley. Thanks to all of you for starting us off. We really appreciate it. So, Courtney, let me start with you. I want to play a little bit more of what we heard during today's hearing from Director Gabbard. Take a look.
The IC assesses the regime in Iran appears to be intact but largely degraded due to attacks on its leadership and military capabilities. Its conventional military power projection capabilities have largely been destroyed, leaving limited options. Iran's strategic position has been significantly degraded.
Courtney, are your sources at the Pentagon basically saying that that assessment by Tulsi Gabbard is correct?
Yeah, a lot of Iran's conventional capabilities have been destroyed. I mean, it's hard to say if it's more than 50% or more than 75%, but when you just look at the sheer number of targets that they've gone after, it would make sense that it's fair to say a large number of them have, and even a significant number have been destroyed. And that's specifically what we're talking about: the ballistic missiles, their drones, which they still have more drones than I think the U.S. would like. We now know they've gone after some of their anti-ship cruise missiles. They're trying to take care of the mine problem. And then they've gone after, of course, the conventional Navy and a lot of the Iranian Air Force.
So the Pentagon is also saying it struck an Iranian missile site along the Strait of Hormuz. Talk about the significance of that and, broadly speaking, where this stands. So
this addresses what has become the biggest issue right now, and that is the Strait of Hormuz and the fact that it remains closed. This was the U.S. used these pretty large bombs that are known as bunker busters, because it means they can basically penetrate down through hardened structures like where these anti-ship cruise missiles were being stored along the coast of the Strait of Hormuz. And they presented a direct threat. We've seen Iran fire these missiles at ships even in recent days. They're difficult to defend against unless you have air cover or you have some sort of anti-missile system on the ship, which a lot of these commercial ships do not, frankly. When you look at it from operationally, this was a win. This was a big win, but it's not going to make an immediate difference in reopening the strait. Iran still has drones, they still have mines, and they still have their fast boats, including some of these unmanned fast boats, which we don't talk a whole lot about, but also really present a direct threat because they can send them out in swarms. All it takes is one to smash into one of those tankers. And frankly, again, we've talked about this on the show. They don't even have to hit. They just have to threaten.
Well, Courtney, let's talk big picture about the Strait of Hormuz, because the president over the weekend had started this campaign to get NATO allies on board with helping to secure the Strait of Hormuz. As of this Wednesday, we are not aware of any allies raising their hands to come forward. We heard President Trump yesterday say he can go it alone. He doesn't need NATO, clearly irate with the fact that no one is stepping forward to help. Why didn't the administration build a coalition of the willing on the front end of this?
So it's hard to say. If I had to guess, I would say it's probably because there is such a mistrust of allies right now on the part of the Trump administration. And so I could see that they didn't want to let them know that something was going to happen in advance that could potentially leak out, that they were going to plan this when they were going to potentially conduct this mission. But it's also not surprising to me that they would try to do this sort of backwards diplomacy, right, where they begin this operation and then they start asking for help. And it comes on the heels of the president and the Secretary of Defense demeaning the allies' contribution in other conflicts. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth openly demeaning allies who fought and died alongside U.S. troops in Afghanistan and elsewhere. So I'm not surprised that these allies wouldn't want to step forward. The reality is it is too dangerous for any Navy, no matter what nation they're coming from, unless you're from Iran. It's too dangerous for any of those ships to be trying to sail through the Strait of Hormuz right now. So I'm not surprised allies are not stepping forward.
All right, Courtney Kube, thank you so much for starting us off today. We really appreciate it. Garrett, Haake, let me turn to you at the White House, and let's talk about the messaging that we are hearing from the president. It continues to evolve, particularly in talking about the Strait of Hormuz. What are your sources telling you about the strategy and his stance today?
It's hard to get much real information on this, Kristen. You may hear the helicopters behind me. The president is going to land here back at the White House in a short time, and perhaps we'll hear something new from him then. But he has been on a journey the last couple of days when it comes to what the position is on the Strait of Hormuz and who should be defending it. I suppose we should say the active position is the one he posted on Truth Social this morning, which is essentially, we broke it, but somebody else will have to buy it and clean it up. The president suggesting that others should be responsible for the strait. Perhaps people who are more dependent on energy that is exported through it will come in and police it. That comes after a period of several days where he suggested the U.S. Navy would do that work, then where he suggested he'd been reaching out to allies and that some of them were even on the way into the region to send ships, before saying, in fact, we don't need their help at all, and then suggesting again today that other countries be responsible for it. I think it speaks to the reality that, as Courtney was just laying out, this is a very difficult actual problem to solve here, and that nobody really wants to be at the tip of the spear of this particular military situation right now. But again, the president's current position doesn't show a lot of understanding of the nuances of these energy markets. It's not just the consumers of these products that would be affected. It would be the whole global market for everything that comes out of the Middle East, basically, that would be disrupted.
Yeah, we are starting to see signs of that already. Garrett, look, we know that there have been divisions within the administration over starting this war in the first place. Vice President J.D. Vance initially not on board with moving forward with this war. Now the position has been that he's all in. We know that he spoke today. What did we learn? What did he say about his position on the war today?
Yeah, if Vance is the most prominent, thought to be internal skeptic of this war, his answer to a question about this today was noteworthy because I think it could probably also be conceived as the way he might be talking about this internally, too, essentially saying that you're going to ultimately have to trust the decisions that the president makes and that that's what he's doing. Listen to this.
I guarantee the president of the United States is not interested in getting us, in the kind of long-term quagmires that we've seen in years past. I know the president. I know the way that he thinks about America's national security. That is not a risk with this president at all.
Kristen, I don't think, Lyndon Johnson or George W. Bush wanted to get into the military quagmires they found themselves in either. But I think what you're seeing here is a line that Vance is using that other skeptics of involvement in Iran could probably point to, which is consistent across the administration, that ultimately it's the president who makes the decisions, and in Donald Trump they trust.
Yeah, really fascinating to hear him answer that question, Garrett. We know the president attended a dignified transfer for 6 U.S. service members today. What do we know about that solemn event? I know it was closed to the press.
Yeah, very little, Kristen. I mean, the families ultimately make the decision about whether they want these transfers to be open to any kind of media today. They chose not to. This was for all 6 crew members of that KC-135 that crashed in the Iraqi desert. I guess it was back over the weekend. Those pictures there of the president arriving in Dover are really all we have. The press pool went back on Air Force One to await the event's conclusion. As I mentioned, the helicopters, still I can hear them behind me, which means the president is on his way back but hasn't landed back here at the White House. He had a pretty significant contingent of lawmakers, the Secretary of Defense with him. Perhaps we'll get more in just a few minutes.
All right, Garrett Haake at the White House for us. Garrett, thank you so much. Matt Bradley, let me turn to you. Israel killed yet another top Iranian official last night, this time the Minister of Intelligence. What do you know about the role he played in the significance of this?
Well, he was the head of the intelligence operation in Iran, which means that he played a singular role in suppressing dissent, in controlling internal messaging by the regime, in sort of counter-espionage, the whole gamut of issues that would have made him basically a very powerful man and one who's very close to the senior leadership. He was assassinated along with 2 others. 3 major figures within the Iranian regime have been killed in just the past 24 hours, including other people who did similar work. Ismail Khatib is who we're talking about. And then, of course, there was Ali Larijani before, the head of the National Security Council, who was kind of more than just an intelligence guy, more of an actual leader, and really the mover and shaker behind the scenes, even before the senior Khamenei was killed the first day of this fighting. So what we're seeing now is the death of yet another senior intelligence official, and one that doesn't necessarily put Trump or Netanyahu any closer to finding a leader who they could pluck up and anoint as the new leader of Iran, one who's more quietist, more cooperative with the West. This was a man who, amongst others, is, by dying, probably going to make that goal even more elusive for those countries who have decided to attack Iran.
Wow. Well, Matt, all of this comes as we saw a wave of Iranian attacks overnight, including cluster bombs over Tel Aviv, which is where you are. What was that like to experience that from the ground, Matt?
Yeah, we've been seeing cluster bombs being used over Tel Aviv and over Israel for about the past 2 weeks. In fact, a huge portion of the weapons that the Iranians have been fired have been cluster bombs. Important to note that while the Israelis are saying that cluster bombs, their use by Iran, shows that the Iranians are using indiscriminate weapons that don't necessarily distinguish or aren't necessarily things that can be aimed properly to avoid civilian casualties. There is a treaty that forbids the use of cluster bombs signed in 2008. Israel is not a party to that. Neither is the United States or Iran or Russia or Ukraine, for that matter. So that's why we've seen cluster bombs being used by the Russians in Ukraine, and now we're seeing them being used by the Iranians. I've been speaking to people here, people who are in the military. They say that the cluster bombs aren't necessarily an unusual challenge or a strange risk to the Israeli public, even though they do, by definition, burst in the atmosphere and send little bomblets all around, putting a lot of civilians in danger. It's the huge ballistic missiles, the ones that aren't clusters, the ones that don't break up, that are still the primary preoccupation for Israel's military.
All right, Matt Bradley, thank you so much. Please continue to stay safe.
We thank you for watching, and remember, stay updated on breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or watch live on our YouTube channel.